It also has a huge abundance of krill and the wildlife that feed on it. And for this reason, there's potential, like as I mentioned earlier, for conflict as krill fishing grows. So it's important for there to be some protection for the animals that feed on krill, to have some areas that are set aside so there's plenty of krill available, particularly because krill seem to be negatively affected by warming and their populations have been in decline. So that's a problem for all of the whales and seals and penguins that like to eat huge amounts of them. And so we're, hopefully there will be, in this process, hopefully the peninsula, which hasn't gotten a lot of attention so far, hopefully people will look at that. And next we're going to move on to South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, which you'll see in a minute. These are UK overseas territories, and so the UK earlier has declared an MPA in this region, and it's pretty big. It's about 1 million square kilometers, but only a small fraction is no-take, and it doesn't really hasn't really displaced any of the existing fishing that's there for toothfish and krill. So it's kind of unclear whether this is much different than what was already happening. But South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands also have huge krill populations and huge aggregations of wildlife that go along with it. On South Georgia, which is only about 170 kilometers long, there are 22 million breeding pairs of just one species of seabird, and then there are 23 or 24 other seabirds that breed there, 90% of the world's fur seals. So it's just huge. If there's impacts from climate change on the krill, there are bound to be huge impacts on those species as well. And similar thing in the South Sandwich Islands, there are 30% of the world's population of chinstrap penguins, which has recently been confirmed to be in sort of a long-term decline, the whole species. So, and also in the South Sandwich Islands, they've recently discovered some hydrothermal vent communities that had new species, including a new species of yeti crab. So on the one hand, you've got some threats to the existing species, and then at the same time, you're also getting a lot of new information about what might be there. So it's very important that these areas are protected for the wildlife and for to protect the stuff we don't know about. And I also would like to mention that it's very common when they do benthic surveys of the Antarctic that they find tons of new species and they learn a whole bunch of information just to highlight how little we know. Moving on to the Eastern Antarctic Shelf, this is a much different area. First of all, it's huge. It covers a wide swath of different kinds of habitats, and also it's considered a data poor region. So although we don't maybe not know a lot about benthic habitats in other places, on the West Antarctic Peninsula and South Georgia and South Sandwich Islands, these areas are pretty heavily, some of the wildlife are well monitored and well studied. That's less the case in the Eastern Antarctic. But Australia and France have put forward a proposal for a series of MPAs along that area. Again, the question is going to be how much will be no-take, how much will be just declared an MPA. And but one interesting thing about the Eastern Antarctic is that it's not warming as much as some of the other areas, so it can be a climate used as a climate reference zone if the no-take areas can be compared to other areas where is fishing or is climate change, and to compare those to the changes that are going on in the East Antarctic. Finally, we come to the Ross Sea, which I think we would say is probably the crown jewel of any MPA network. It's one of the least impacted ecosystems on the planet in terms of human disturbances, and it's very useful to scientists because of this, because it's, as one scientist has put it, when you're looking at other marine ecosystems that aren't as healthy, it's hard to figure out how to make them healthier unless you know what a healthy ecosystem looks like. And the Ross Sea is one of the few places on Earth that you can probably see an ecosystem that has been functioning much the same way as it has for a very long time. even though there has been some toothfish fishing and some whaling there in the past, it still has been evaluated to be very low, have very low impact. And also, again, it's 2% of the Southern Ocean, but it's highly productive. So there, a quarter of the world's emperor penguins live there, about a third of the world's Adelie penguins, and significant proportions of killer whales and weddell seals. So it's a small slice, but it's a very important area. And the main issue with the Ross Sea, there have been some proposals for MPAs and put forward already, but the main issue is that there is a decent sized toothfish fishery there, and that also overlaps with some ecologically important areas. And the question is how to balance the desire to protect this incredibly unique, incredibly valuable ecosystem with sort of the short-term gain from toothfish fishing. And so this is a very, very brief intro, but and the Ross Sea can also be used as a climate reference area, just because it's going to be one of the slowest areas to warm on the continent. So it can be a reference area for scientists and a refuge area for some of these species that might be losing habitat in other places. So this is just a basic overview of some of the things that we're trying to accomplish with this MPA network. Protecting areas where important scientific research can be done, creating climate reference areas again for research, protecting some of these large aggregations of marine animals and their foraging grounds, creating no-take areas to protect ecosystems from the impacts of fishing, and in some cases protecting areas that benthic habitats that we don't even know anything about. So the main obstacle in doing this is convincing all of the countries that are members of CAMLR, there are 25 different members, of the value of some of these less tangible benefits that I've just mentioned as compared to the more tangible benefits of fishing. CAMLR is not very well known. It's not in the public eye. There's no public pressure on its decisions. So in some cases, the decisions about where to put the boundaries for MPAs are not made on science, but on where people want to fish. There has been one MPA already created in the South Orkney Islands, and there was a large chunk taken out of it, basically because somebody might want to fish there in the future, which obviously is not necessarily the way that we as an environmental NGO would say is the best way to protect ecosystems. So what the Antarctic Ocean Alliance has been trying to do is raise some public awareness about all the incredible things that are in Antarctic marine ecosystems, and what kind of values sort of more general values to humanity you could have from a very good network of marine protected areas. And it's very crucial for members of the public to get involved in this, because the southern Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, they're not the property of one country. It belongs to everybody in a sense. So we're encouraging people to join the watch and learn more about the Antarctic and what's going on there, and why you should care about MPAs in a place that's so far away. And yeah, that's it.
Do you want to tell them how to join the watch?
AntarcticOcean.org.
I might just mention that on that website, AntarcticOcean.org, there's a petition, a global petition. We're up to almost 100,000 people. We'd like to have it be 150,000 before the CAMLR meeting starts in about a month. And looking forward, we want to have 1 million people sign this petition. So every vote counts, so to speak. So please visit it. You have a quick question now, or you want to wait for the next? Okay, go ahead.
It's just a short announcement.
Yeah.
Some extra information, if I may.
Use the microphone now.
Sorry. It's just to announce that as we speak, there is a CAMLR workshop going on in Brussels this week to determine or to propose a number of marine protected areas.
That's right, it's on the circumpolar potential, but Dorothy's going to tell us about that. So our last speaker on this panel is Dorothy Hare. She's the Marine Program Officer for IUCN's Global Marine and Polar Program. She works on both Arctic and Antarctic issues. And I wanted just to say that Dorothy participated with me and about 25 other people last year at a very interesting event that SCAR, the Scientific Committee on Antarctic Research, put together to develop a 21st century conservation strategy for Antarctica. And it's been a pleasure working with Dorothy over the last few years. And watch this space, so to speak, for the eventual Antarctic conservation strategy. It's going to be a really marvelous document. Dorothy?
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim, for the kind introduction. Yeah, this presentation will not focus on the conservation strategy, but as Jim said, it will be something in the making. So yeah, please watch out for that. I will dive a little bit more into the MPA discussion, and there's a lot to say about MPAs in the Southern Ocean. And I'm sure there are a few people in the room who have much longer experience in this process than I have. But what I want to do, and maybe also bringing it a bit back to the governance part we started with in the Arctic, and also looking at it, what might be lessons learned, etc., from the two different processes, to look at what's CAMLR's goal when it comes to MPAs, what did it achieve until now, and bringing it within a timeline perspective of the different efforts that have been taking place. And then, as I said, finishing off with some lessons learned or some personal reflection of having participated so far in 2 of the CAMLR meetings and some of the workshops, and maybe just sharing those personal views with you. CAMLR is, as Claire said, it's an international convention, but we also have the CAMLR, which is often the confusing acronyms, the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources. And within that context, they set the goals of establishing a representative system of MPAs in the Southern Ocean by 2012. And so far, as Claire mentioned already as well, is there has been an MPA declared in the South Orkney in 2009, but now last year the members came up with a framework conservation measure, which is basically the binding agreement taken by all members to basically provide a step-by-step approach of what should all conservation measure for an MPA entail. Before showing a bit in more detail the conservation measures, I wanted to sort of show you, based on this timeline, that sort of how MPAs, or the concept of MPAs, have been part of the management of the Southern Ocean. And I started actually when, in 1982, CAMLR was agreed upon, that in the actual text there is already the notion and the concept of MPAs through the open and closing of areas. And since CAMLR was established with the conservation not only of living marine resources as an economic resource, but in the larger context of ecosystems and the species that depend on it, you can really argue that the notion of MPAs has been in CAMLR for quite a while. But then, as such, MPAs and terms MPAs came more into CAMLR around 2004, after the World Summit on Sustainable Development. And as you can see on the below bottom, and I think that's what the colleague already referred to, within this sort of official context of CAMLR, there's been many workshops, scientific workshops, setting different priority areas to look at MPAs. And I think that's sort of maybe to give the example of how CAMLR does it in this legal setting, and which might be sort of for drawing some lessons learned for some of the Arctic processes. And then just highlighting, as Claire mentioned as well, now the upcoming meeting, there will be more discussions happening on some of the MPAs, but it will be interesting to see, as the whole goal of establishing a complete network of MPAs will not be achieved by 2012, how will the members and decide to continue this beyond 2012. This is just to give you the example of the South Orkney Island, and if you see there on the screen is this sort of edge that Claire mentioned, which was cut out due to possible fishing interest. And what it basically says in this case is that all types of fishing activities are prohibited other than scientific research, no discharge, no dumping from any fishing vessels. And why I raise this point is that it is for fishing vessels. So I think the question is, or I think in this was the very first one, I'll come back to it later, there has not been yet this sort of how do we deal with other impacts that might threaten any of those objectives of the MPA. Oops, sorry. This is then, as I mentioned in the beginning, last year members decided on a general framework. It's a step-by-step approach a little bit to give guidance for how to establish an MPA in the Southern Ocean. So each MPA proposal should state clearly what are the objectives, which kind of activities are prohibited or restricted, and how should they be managed, which also calls for a management plan, a research and monitoring plan, but then also clearly state what is the period of designation and a review. And I think that sort of, from my perspective, adding this review is really showing the adaptability a process needs to have these days, and really showing, giving, obviously monitoring takes a lot of time, but using that opportunity to really say, does the MPA reach the objectives it set itself? And then I think one of the sort of progressive points as well is that CCAMLR members are sort of asked to look at what other activities are needed from other forums, like for example the Polar Code, the big Antarctic Treaty System, what might be needed to ensure that the objectives of the MPA are not threatened. These are just sort of the 6 CCAMLR MPA objectives, which the members agreed to, that those are the most important ones. And Claire obviously mentioned some already, like scientific reference areas, resilience and climate change adaptation, protection of representative areas, biodiversity and habitat. So I'm just going to leave them up there for sort of for your reference. But then getting a bit more into the process, and I think as I mentioned before, it is an international convention. It has legally binding measures in so-called conservation measures, which is sort of one of the bigger differences to the Arctic processes currently. But I think also the scientific process we are seeing is, as I said before as well, under this umbrella of CCAMLR. There's a lot of national work going on, but there's really a point where all this work comes together. It's discussed in the many different working groups of CCAMLR, and then actually comes into the scientific committee, which is the body that advises the commission on these elements. And I think it's sort of what we see in the Arctic is a lot of national work as well, a lot of work by NGOs like NRDC and others to sort of try and help identify those areas. But I think in that sense, the Antarctic process has already, within its context of CCAMLR, quite an advanced step, if you like. Just very briefly, one point which I find very important is also that the CCAMLR process sort of really agreed that different methods can be used to identify MPAs. And as we all know, some of these areas are data poor. You can't put them into a GIS markset database. So I think they're really progressive in a way to, as long as the process is transparent, it really shows what type of information has been used, etc., that MPAs can be established based on different scientific methods. And also, not entirely sure what that actually is at, but members are trying to sort of provide a collective GIS database to have this data all together. And here, just to show you, and this is also what I showed in the timeline. First, CCAMLR identified these 11 priority areas, which some have advanced more than others, but now at some of the last meeting and workshop, they accepted that after having done the first step to go and identify those areas, to really look at them in a more coherent way, and sort of came up with these 9 planning domains, which I assume will be the continued way of looking at how to establish the networks of MPAs. And just coming back again to this process slide, I think obviously with the rigorous scientific process and actually how it works in CCAMLR is that CCAMLR provides the best available scientific advice, and only when it basically passes that body, it can go to the Commission. And there I think it is nevertheless ultimately a political decision, and that's not new, but I think it's for MPAs around the world where it often becomes the discussion between fishing or non-fishing. And sort of turning towards the end, I think, and maybe a little bit provocatively, being at the CAMLAR meetings myself, well, only for 2 times, but sort of I think the question about what is an MPA is sometimes nevertheless something which I'm not sure, is it used as an excuse by some? Is it a dilemma, or is it nevertheless an opportunity to use it as one of the tools in the toolbox? And what I said in the example before with the South Orkney as well is that in the case of CAMLAR, which does have less threats, at least at this stage, than the Arctic in many ways, the scope is sort of limited to the fishing vessels, and sort of the need to really work outside of the MPA and to make sure that the objectives are not threatened. Hence why I think this approach for ecosystem-based management is so important, related to fishing in particular in the Antarctic, but shipping, etc., and others in the Arctic. And so just to sum this up again, sort of my personal lessons learned, I guess, but to any